So back in the heady days of the early 2000s, I came across an RPG developer called Bioware. And as we know, Bioware became quite big. You know, they did that whole Baldur's Gate thing that everyone loves. And then they went on and did Knights of the Old Republic and Mass Effect and Dragon Age and all that lot. And they got very, very popular. And then EA bought them. And it didn't end up so well for them, did it? This left a gap in the market, because nobody else was really doing Bioware games. So in stepped CD Projekt RED. And of course they became famous for their Witcher trilogy. So I thought to myself, oh well, so much for Bioware. They're gone, but at least we've got CD Projekt RED. The problem with that is CD Projekt RED, I think they kind of peaked. And with Cyberpunk 2077, it just wasn't what I wanted. Now, there have been a number of studios that have since attempted the whole kind of cinematic, third-person RPG with story-rich environments, and none of them have really, come close to the whole Bioware thing. And that's really, really disappointing. There's been lots of crowdfunded RPGs, and narrative-heavy RPGs and so on, but the vast majority of them are from the top-down perspective. Now that's all very well and good if you enjoy those kind of RPGs. I do enjoy them from time to time, but they're not the same as the third-person over-the-head RPG. It would be like comparing the Elder Scrolls with the Temple of Elemental Evil. It's not the same game. Yes, there's a fantasy setting. Yes, there's a story and there's combat with monsters and so on. But it's not really the same thing, is it? And while you can technically go into the third person with the Bethesda games, it's not the same. The branching dialogue paths and statistics altering conversation options were only really seen in the third person from Obsidian Entertainment's Fallout New Vegas, another one of my favourite games of all time. So why all this preamble, Lonnie? Well, the reason is that's why I got excited about Spiders. Spiders is a small French studio, and they are janky. Now, jank is a sort of gameplay that's a bit rough around the edges, it doesn't have everything in its place. It stands out as a bit off, and people are willing to forgive a certain level of jank if the game is doing something that they feel is needed in the gaming industry. And in the case of Spiders, it is. Spiders were pretty obvious about who they were and what they wanted to do. It was essentially, hey, did you like Knights of the Old Republic, Jade Empire, Dragon Age, Mass Effect? Okay then. And the problem with Spiders is that they only had a handful of people and a very small budget. So some corners had to be cut. You ever go into a supermarket and you have like the named brands and you know what to expect, there's a certain level of quality there, and then you have the off brands where it's like, yes, this is technically the thing, but it's not really the same. Spiders is the off-brand Bioware. The music isn't as good, the characterization isn't as good, the writing is a lot poorer, and the dialogue is not as well spoken, and the world building itself, The first Spiders game I played was Mars Warlocks. I think that was from around 2013. They have their own engine that they licensed out and have slowly been tinkering and upgrading. Mars Warlocks was their first serious attempt at a proper RPG. So in Mars Warlocks you play this guy called Roy Temperance, who is a mysterious stranger with a troubled history that you don't really know much about. You end up in this labour camp and you have to escape, and you meet this fella called Innocence, and there's a whole plot and so on, but really the storytelling of Mars Warlocks is environmental in nature. Sure, you do have conversations with people, and they do tell more of the setting and the sort of depravity involved in the hellscape that is Mars, but it's really looking at the surroundings and just how drab and dreary and horrible they are that really makes you appreciate it. Because it was an early effort from them, you had to modify things like the FOV using text files, and I had to do various modifications to get it running nicely on my system. All in all, it's okay. I mean, I finished it, I completed it in about 13 hours, and it was a decent story. It wasn't really told the best, but it was palatable. And it had this sort of Arkham Asylum knockoff style combat that was okay, I guess. Alright. And that's pretty much how I'd sum it up, to be honest. It's like 6 or 7 out of 10. It's like, yeah, okay, this is alright. Bound by Flame was a game I actually played recently, where they took everything they learned from Mars Warlocks, and they said, hey, you know what's popular right now? Game of Thrones and Dark Souls. So they combined the two. They had the gritty Game of Thrones rip-off tale about a man who has been infested by a demon and has to essentially fight what are the discount version of the White Walkers from Game of Thrones. And it felt like the game had ambitions beyond itself, and it's something that Spiders does more and more often. You'll see it as their games progress. They have this grandiose idea, and they just don't have the budget or the hours or the manpower to pull it off. The first 2 acts of this game are just like discount Dragon Age, but with Dark Souls-y combat. And it takes a bit of getting used to if you're just into the narrative-heavy RPGs and you don't really play Dark Souls games. And for the most part, it's quite good. The voice acting is still suspect, and the facial animations aren't great, and the graphics, tolerable, not great. But the story carries on at a fair clip, and you're like, hey, that's okay. And for about 2 acts, you're slowly growing in power and stature, and deciding whether to let the demon control you or whether you fight it at every step of the way. And then the 3rd act comes along, and it just falls off a cliff. Terrible level design, repurposed bosses as normal mobs, and just the story itself just not good. Then we have the Technomancer, which is the answer to Mass Effect. It's a return to Mars, and it's set around the same time, and you hear references to Mars Warlogs, and you even meet people who have been in Mars Warlogs, and you're like, hey, I vaguely remember that guy, yeah. But the general feel of the game is very different. It's much more futuristic. The setting itself is a lot less doom-laden in terms of movement, in terms of the just general visualization. There's no problems with the graphics or the sound or the HUD options, or, you know, it's all sort of coming together, and you're kind of thinking, oh, this could be promising. And so much of it is. But unfortunately, the story itself, 6 or 7 out of 10 again. And that's the problem. Bioware, their games, the gameplay, yeah, it's alright, but the real selling point is the story and the characters. In Technomancer, the characters are okay, some of them are less likeable than others, but the story itself, it falls a bit flat again. And you're seeing a pattern here, where the gameplay elements are slowly improving bit by bit and piece by piece, but each time they make an improvement in one area, it just highlights how poor another area is. And in this case, it's story and level design. There is constant backtracking through mobs of enemies. There's constant go to point A, go back to point B, go back to point A again, and that's your quest, and it's very dull and grindy in that respect. But even after you've gone through the grind and so on, and you get to the final act, and you beat the boss, and you're on your way to find out the epic conclusion, it decides to throw a completely random Dark Souls-y boss level at you for no reason, after beating the main boss. And you're sort of like, really? Really? Then you get to the epic conclusion of your voyage, and it's a damp squib. It's a real letdown. The writing isn't good. It doesn't feel narratively like it's rewarding you for anything. And you're like, oh, okay. But it's better than what came before. It's a marked improvement from Bound by Flame. And on a technical level, it's much better than Mars Warlocks. And so we move on to Greedfall. Greedfall is the one where people were really saying, right, Spiders have got it this time. They've ironed out all their inconsistencies and problems, and this time, instead of setting it on Mars or on Game of Thrones knockoff land, they're setting it in a post-colonial world where you travel via ship to this native land that you're slowly colonizing. And you're this guy called Desarde, and you're in a position of influence and power, and you have to go and negotiate things with people and so forth. And again, it's improved. The gameplay is improved. There's fast travel now. There are various things that have been smoothed out by Spiders in response to the negative feedback. And yet again, the story, it's dull, it's boring, it's grindy, there's lots of backtracking, and the protagonist is dull as dishwater. And there's your problem with Spiders games. You play them for about 6 or 7 hours and you're like, wow, this is really cool. And then by about the 8th hour, it's like you've seen everything and you're like, alright, I'm bored now. Where other games would have side quests that feel even bigger or better than the main quest, the Spiders games, it feels like checklists. You're going back and forth and ticking boxes. It's very Kingdoms of Amalur or, World of Warcraft, where they don't feel like they have any substance to them. And there's a lot of talk, but most of it, in terms of its writing, it's not that great. And I keep stressing on the writing, because they're a French team and they're translating their writing into English, but the French, I think, isn't that interesting in the first place. There is no Chris Avallone-inspired dialogue here, and that's what keeps RPG players going. Not just the setting, but also the characters within the world. And if the characters within the world aren't, that interesting, it doesn't feel like much of a reward. So yeah, that's Spiders. They're playable, and apparently Greedfall was quite the success financially. And they've received a lot more monetary backing, which is interesting because if they hire a few interesting writers and they get a slightly bigger production team, Greedfall 2 or Steel Rising might just be the turning point. And we'll look back on these games as the essential growing pains. Kinda like The Witcher and The Witcher 2 were for CD Projekt RED. It's just taken Spiders that little bit longer. They might have it in them. We'll just have to wait and see.